Tell me about Cowboy Bob.
Can I use your phone for 1 second to just remember the first date of their crime?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, let me... there you are. I'm getting away from the tabs I have open, which are for the game Devil May Cry 3, seeing if I'd like it.
Yep.
And from the Magic the Gathering Secret Lair series.
And you know you didn't have to say that out loud, and you
cards.
should have said that it was pornography, yes?
Yeah.
Okay, wonderful.
I wish I'd said
All
it
right.
was porno.
Yeah.
Time to soldier through. Welcome to a brand new episode of Lucky Paper Radio. My name is Andy. I'm here, as always, with my co-host, Anthony Hylian Explorer Maddox.
That applies to basically everyone on this day, doesn't it?
It really seems like it does. I can't remember a more all-encompassing cultural moment, honestly, at least in my communities, than right now. Like, everybody I know is just playing the new Zelda.
I mean, I think you could say the same thing about the last couple big video games that were released, but
Like what?
I don't know. Animal Crossing,
Sure,
Breath
yeah.
of the Wild #1.
Animal Crossing is the last time I remember something so... But even then, I feel like there were people that were like, that's not for me.
That's fair, yeah.
Right now, everybody I know that has a Switch is playing Zelda. And I'm watching Hillary play, and it's great. I love to watch my wife play video games. It's like a little Twitch in my own house.
No spoilers, though. Please. She's way far ahead of me, I think.
She's been playing a lot. It's only been out for... Let's see. Today is Saturday morning. So it's been out for like 36 hours at time of record, and I think she's played for 14 of those 36 hours or 16
That's good.
or something.
Those are good numbers.
Yeah, she's getting her numbers up. She's a pro. No time to dilly-dally and talk about Zelda, though, Anthony, because we are talking about an interesting topic on this episode. So, I think we're in a unique position. So many Magic podcasts are about a specific format, or they're about getting better at limited or whatever. And because of that, we very rarely get to discuss topics in a very broad sense. But today, I just want to talk about ramp.
I mean, you say get to. We can do whatever we want.
Yeah, I misspoke. What I should have said is that most Magic content is not very broad in the sense that it's just talking about concepts in the abstract.
Yeah, I would say actually the one that does stand out that is like that is Mark Rosewater's Drive to Work, where he will just take like an aspect of the game and go really deep on it, which I have joked before, that is the best Cube podcast, and that's actually not that much of a joke. A lot of the topics that he talks about on there are really relevant to Cube design, because Cube design is sort of this like little subset of game design light.
It's definitely true that Drive to Work is the only podcast that kind of talks about things really abstractly. I think sometimes he doesn't actually go that deep, though. For the sake of keeping it accessible to other people, he very often like retreads things that if you're an experienced Magic player, you already know, which is, I'm glad he does that, right? It's important for his show that anybody be able to like pop it in, hit play, and learn something and get something out of the show. But as somebody that has listened to a bunch of hours of Drive to Work and is very invested in Magic, a lot of it is sort of retreading the same old ground for me.
That is true. It does feel like his target audience, like the person he has in mind that he's talking to, is like a really underqualified new intern at Wizards, which
somebody who got the job because
works.
of pure nepotism. They're not qualified at all.
Sure, yeah.
So let's just start with the basics, right? So I want to talk about ramp abstractly as a concept. I want to talk about it relative to retail limited, relative to constructed. To some degree, you and I are not constructed experts, so that'll all be taken with a grain of salt. And then I think we'll end with like talking about it relative to Cube, but very broadly, right? Like ramp is, to me, just one of the most core aspects of Green's identity in the game of Magic. Do you agree?
I agree.
Going all the way back to Alpha, we have cards that produce mana, and I guess Alpha didn't have any cards that tutored up basic lands, right? We didn't get the first Rampant Growth until later on.
Yeah, Rampant Growth was first printed in Mirage, which is obviously the titular card that we get the term ramp from.
Exactly, yeah. But we had Llanowar Elves in Alpha and similar cards. I think there was more than just Llanowar Elves. I don't know. We had cards that ramped, that produced mana, that basically allowed you to play things ahead of curve. And this has, for the most part, through Magic's history, been a very green thing. Colorless has also gotten a lot of ramp, and due to just the way cards have been designed and, quirks of power balance, it just so happens that some of the best ramp happens to be colorless, and so that kind of, in some ways, eats into the uniqueness of ramp as a green thing, but you really don't get ramp in white, black, blue, and red. White, very rarely, occasionally, will get like a, if your opponent has more lands than you, kind of ramp, and then, black and red have the ritual kind of thing, but in terms of making a... And I guess blue has Dreamscape Artists. Okay, Magic's a big game. At some point, every color's gotten a little bit of everything. But for the most part, this is a green thing.
Yeah, I mean, when they print new sets that care about different things, they will have colors sort of take their own twist on it. So blue will have some ramp, but it's often like only ramping if you are casting instant sorceries or casting artifacts if it's an environment that cares about artifacts, things like that.
Or Dreamscape Artist.
Why does that card exist?
It's Time Spiral Block.
Okay.
It's all weird and funky. And it makes sense to me that ramp would be one of the first things you would maybe invent as a mechanic, right? Like if you have a game where you have these fundamental resources you're navigating between, right? You have your life total, you have mana, you have boards, you have cards in play that affect the board. The idea that you would have some way to interact with each of those resources makes a lot of sense, and green and ramp being the way to interact with mana as a resource and adjust the fact that in Magic you can only play one land a turn and every land produces 1 mana, and actually warp that in some way. It seems like a very fundamental thing to design in a game where mana is one of the core units of resources.
Yeah, I mean, when you look at early Magic design, a lot of it does sort of feel like that sort of really, really bottom-up design where it's like, here are the resources in the game. Let's make cards that just interact with these resources in different ways and see what happens. And that's how we get, the boon cycle where you have 1 mana for 3 cards or 1 mana for 3 life. And it's like, why not? We don't really know how this game is going to be balanced yet. We're just going to exchange a bunch of resources around with cards and see what happens.
Weirdly, in that one, black got the mana.
Yeah, I mean, that's another thing that should be noted is like, a lot of times things feel, or it's sort of hard to get a grip on what the color pie is because it has changed a lot over time. So initially black had Dark Ritual, that was sort of like one of the most powerful ramp spells in alpha, but they ended up sort of shifting rituals to red, and so we're kind of looking at this historical artifact where we can't necessarily just look at all the cards at once and say this is what the color pie looks like. We kind of have to just look at the recent slice of them.
And when they shifted rituals to red, they also made them all worse because they were like, oh, Dark Ritual's much too good. Yeah. So even though black only has like a couple rituals in the history of all of Magic, they also happen to be some of the best ones because that was back when cards were balanced differently.
Or not at all.
Or not at all. So because it's so core to green's color identity, we have seen some form of mana ramp, I'm pretty sure, in basically every retail set that has ever been released. I'm curious if somebody out there, some eagle-eyed listener, can point out a retail set that didn't have any ramp. Wasn't there a set that was basically all black, the Scourge or whatever? Maybe Scourge didn't have a lot of ramp in it somehow because it had very few green cards. Either way.
Yeah, so it was heavy. It was a weird set because it was heavy black, but there was still every color represented.
Yeah, so maybe there's not ramp in there. Who knows? But I think for the most part, we've seen ramp in every single limited set. But I was thinking, Anthony, can you think of the last time we had a limited format that felt like it was dominated by ramp, or like ramp was like a key identity of the limited format?
It doesn't come up often, and I feel like this is something we're going to circle back to when we come to our own cubes and sort of how we think about ramp, is that ramp isn't really a part of most limited environments at all.
Well, it is, but it's never like defining, right? Like I'm thinking back to like Dominaria Limited, which I played a bunch of, and which reprinted Llanowar Elves, or Elvish Mystic. It was Llanowar Elves, I'm pretty sure.
Yeah.
And that was a very good card, right? In that limited set, you would take it, you would play it, but you were never going to get more than 2 or 3 of them. Maybe you have a couple, and Grow from the Ashes, the big Rampant Growth spell that was in that set. But you really can't have enough density to make your deck focused on ramp. It's not like, okay, well, I have all these ramp spells, I'm going to play just a whole pile of 7 and 8 drops. That's just not really what you can do in retail limited.
Yeah, a couple sets do stand out. Like the Brothers' War sort of had this promise of making a bunch of Power Stones and then being able to cast the big prototype cards for their full cost. I feel like that didn't really pan out in the limited format, where there were just aggressive enough decks that wasn't something that you could do often, but it was sort of there as a theme. And some of the Eldrazi
But that was colorless, importantly, so if we're talking about
true, yeah,
like ramp as a thing about green's color identity, Power Stones explicitly were colorless.
That's true. And then the other thing that comes to mind is some of the Zendikar sets with the Eldrazi, where you had the Scions and Spawns that, again, that's colorless, so that's a little bit of a weird twist. But yeah, the couple times that I can think of ramp being like a core thematic part of the sets are just colorless.
Yeah, so in some ways, it's like the way that we have ramp in retail limited is kind of, I was actually thinking about it related to counterspells, right? Like in constructed Magic, you can build a like control counterspell deck, right? A deck that is designed to counter most of your opponent's meaningful spells. You are always holding mana up and you're very focused on that strategy. If you printed a really good counterspell into a retail limited set, you still wouldn't be able to draft a deck like that in retail limited. You would just have a counterspell in your deck and you'd have to just decide, well, now I'm going to hold mana up or now I'm not. But it would be kind of clunky, right? You wouldn't be optimizing the ideal play patterns of the card because you can't have a deck focused on it. And it feels to me like that's what ramp is in most drafted Magic. It's like, well, you get a couple good ramp cards, and this is just a good rate. It's good to have a 1-mana 1/1 that produces a green mana that'll let you pay a 3-drop on turn 2 sometimes, but you're not going to have a density of them such that you can really change the rest of your draft to be focused on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's this adjacent sort of topic, which is mana fixing, which I feel like in Retail Limited, a lot of the ramp spells end up being more valuable as mana fixing.
Sure.
So you mentioned like Grow from the Ashes that lets you get 2 lands. That's often relevant. It wouldn't necessarily be good enough if it was just making more green mana, but the fact that it also fixes you and allows you to splash for more colors is where like those two things combined end up being worth a card in a lot of Retail Limited environments.
Yeah, that's true. That does make, and there is definitely something related here between ramp and mana fixing. So it's kind of funny to me that like you and I don't play Constructed really, and
I think that's very fair to say.
Yeah, I mean we play Commanders technically Constructed, and I've had various proxy decks in various Eternal formats over the years, but never played many of them in detail. But it's funny that we've mostly interacted with Magic through Limited, and yet through Limited, I do feel like this whole aspect of Green's identity is kind of. You can't really interact. It's kind of invisible in some ways, right? Like, again, every once in a while, you get a Llanowar Elves, you get a whatever. Maybe you get like a Llanowar Visionary you're going to set, just like a pushed card that happens to ramp. But it's very incidental. It doesn't feel to me like you're really interacting with something fundamentally different about Green's color pie or something. It's just like, this card's powerful in this way that it allows you to do this thing. But it's funny. I feel like ramp is actually not a huge presence in Retail Limited, which if you draft, that's the only kind of Magic you play pretty much.
Yeah, I think that's true.
And it's funny that all the examples we could think of were colorless. There's actually really a whole topic here of just about how colorless ramp, I think, really has eaten into Green's identity as the ramp color, just because so much colorless ramp is really pushed. In terms of Constructed, I was trying to think of what feel like iconic ramp decks to me in Constructed. And, things that came to mind were like Legacy Elves, which is not that great anymore, but is still a deck you could play. Tron in Modern is a colorless again, but a lot of the cards that help you find those Tron lands end up being green if you're playing green Tron, which is pretty common. Legacy Mud, which is a real old school Legacy deck that I haven't seen anyone play in a long time, which just basically plays like Grim Monoliths and Metal Workers to like spit out Wormcoil Engines and Eldrazi and stuff. Weird old ramp deck that plays no green. Mud because it's literally just artifacts and brown cards. Amulet Titan, the modern deck that Dom Harvey has been key in bringing to the fore and documenting is I think iconic ramp deck that is currently very good in Modern. These decks to me really start to feel like combo decks. Like I think ramp as a mechanic when you push it to constructed limits really just feels like combo, right? Like all those decks I think could fairly be described as combo decks, right? Legacy Elves, the combo is a bunch of ramp, and then you go get a Crater of Behemoth with either Natural Order or you just draw it and cast it, right?
Right, it's not just about getting this tempo advantage of getting a big threat into play a little bit early. It is about getting a game-winning threat way earlier than you're supposed to, which, yeah, I totally agree, feels a lot like combo.
Yeah, I mean, Amulet Titan is definitely a combo deck as far as I'm concerned, in that you combine a few cards and produce just insane amounts of resources that don't really make sense mathematically. A couple amulets and one Primeval Titan, and you all of a sudden are making like 40 mana or whatever, which is definitely a combo, I think. It's not this like incremental interaction with one of the fundamental resources of the game. It's like this explosive A plus B thing where you need A and B, right? You can't just have all the ramp spells and no payoff. You need those two things to work, and it ends up being very committed, very all in, right? Like it's hard to think of a deck that has incremental ramp as part of its core strategy in Constructed. And again, I'm not like, neither of us are experts in Constructed. I would actually love to hear in the comments what some of these decks might be that, are taking advantage of incremental ramp. I can think all the way back to the days in Legacy when Deathrite Shaman was legal, and that card was just so good on its own and also happened to be a ramp card. Again, a ramp card that you can play outside of green decks, that a lot of decks had effectively incremental ramp as part of their identity, because if you had Deathrite Shamans in your deck, you could ramp. But, aside from stuff like that, it's hard to think of decks that have that kind of just give me a little bit of an edge, a little bit of an advantage in my way I'm spending mana, and that's going to be my deck strategy. It's really this committed combo kind of line, which made me think about the difference between a ramp deck and a deck with ramp cards in it, which again, I'll come back to my counterspell thing. Like a counterspell deck feels a lot different than a deck that just has some counterspells in it.
Yeah, definitely. It's a difference between like having some interaction versus just being all about controlling the game.
I think it's important to note that to me, I look at ramp cards as pure tempo cards. And we can litigate the slight differences in everyone's definitions of tempo. But to me, it's like lots of decks that play Llanowar Elves would never touch a 1-mana 1/1, right? Like, they don't really care about the creature for the most part. Maybe they do in the sense that it's another body in play for Crater of Behemoth to count, but you are playing it because it is a mana resource, right? I mean, even more directly, we can look at cards like Wild Growth and Utopia Sprawl, absent ways to untap lands, and just say, like, this is just mana, right? Like, otherwise it's not affecting the board at all. And to me, anytime you are sacrificing cards, right? Like, if we say that 1-mana 1/1 is not worth a card, or obviously that Utopia Sprawl, that enchantment that happens to be enchanting a land, is not worth a card, you're sacrificing that for a mana advantage. That to me is like almost the definition of tempo. And I think people often think of tempo as like, oh, it's like blue-red spells where you like play a cheap threat and then counterspell stuff. And I think that is a form of tempo too, where it's basically like you're pressuring your opponent's life total, therefore kind of constricting the game and changing the way they sequence and then abusing that. But I also totally think that ramp decks are tempo decks, and what you're trying to do is speed up your deck so your deck gets to its end game faster than your opponent can either stop you or get to their own end game.
Yeah, I mean, it's about trading cards in hand as a resource for a bigger threat earlier so you can pressure your opponent.
So when I look at like a ramp deck in Cube, for example, that I've drafted, I'll oftentimes count like the mana sources, right? Like instead of just having, here's my creatures and non-creatures or whatever, and saying, oh, well, this is a 14 creature deck. If 6 of those creatures are just mana dorks, like it's not a 14 creature deck. It's like an 8 creature deck, right? Because most of those creatures don't really matter as creatures for the most part. They are just there to produce mana. They're essentially additional lands. They're lands that you can play more than one a turn of, essentially. You're trading the fragility of a creature and investing mana in it as a card to skirt the you can play only one land per turn fundamental rule of Magic. But you're really playing a deck that is like full of lands. So in a ramp deck, I'll often look at that to try and figure out, like, do I have enough action here, right? Because I'm effectively playing 23 mana sources, 24 mana sources. Does that give me enough action in the remainder of the cards to actually make sense for that commitment to ramp? Which is where I think we get to the nature of ramp payoffs, right? If you are playing these cards that are putting you down resources, essentially, like I'm down a card in order to go up on speed, up on my mana advantage, the things you play with that mana have to be able to be either so powerful they just take over the game and nothing else really matters once they resolve, or they have to make up for the fact that you went down so many cards and recoup that advantage in some more concrete way.
Yeah, I mean, that makes a lot of sense. I think that's a reasonable way to think about it. And it is sort of like on this spectrum of combo where you need these pieces that work together. If you just have a bunch of ramp cards and you're just ramping into more ramp, it's not actually going to amount to anything. You need something to actually justify that inclusion of just generating a lot of extra resources.
Yeah, which is why I think especially in green we see that cards with enter the battlefield value or planeswalkers that have value turn over turn, something that can just produce a theoretically indefinite amount of value if left in play or if you dump mana into it, being the ideal payoffs, right? Like if you just ramp into, a Colossal Dreadmaw, then a single...
Then you're feeling great.
Well, but then a single Doomblade or whatever, like effectively 4-for-1-sy, right? If you spend 4 ramp spells to get your Dreadmaw out on turn 3, then they just Doomblade it. They effectively nullified not just that one card, but all of the cards you invested in getting that into play early. So it's like you're opening yourself up to potential big swings in card advantage in your opponent's favor by playing these ramp spells if the things you're paying off the ramp with are not resilient in some way or are not recouping that advantage.
Yeah, I mean, as a player, it is similar to like reanimation targets where you want things that generate value in the face of removal because when you're spending multiple cards to get that threat in play, if you lose to a Doomblade, you're in a pretty bad situation.
Yeah, it's a lot like Reanimator in that way. That's a very relevant comparison, I think. The original reason I want to talk about ramp was because I want to talk about ramp relative to our cubes, and specifically your cubes, because it's safe to say you're a lover of green, right?
Yeah, I think that's very, very safe to say.
You've called yourself a green-white mage in the past, or you said you'd like to be a green-white mage, but if you're honest...
I think of myself that way.
And in a lot of the cubes you've designed, you have essentially not included ramp. Maybe there's a random card here or there that happens to be able to produce mana. I'm thinking of like a Hope Tender or whatever. But you do not have ramp as a theme. There's not a bunch of ramp cards in green. And I'm wondering how you as a cube designer feel about this major part of green's color identity and why you've avoided it in so many of your cubes.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've touched on a lot of the aspects already, which is that I'm really coming to Magic from the context of Limited. That is, aside from Cube, the format that I have enjoyed the most and played the most, and it really isn't a big feature of a lot of those environments. There is, like we mentioned, here or there, you'll get something that might generate a little bit of a tempo advantage, but it's not the core identity of a lot of green decks or, any decks in a lot of Limited formats. I think the other thing, just sort of from a kind of gameplay perspective about the kind of games that I enjoy, is it is a really swingy kind of strategy. If you are both trying to combine these cards that are just about generating resources with these cards that will recoup those resources or put enough pressure on your opponent to actually justify that, it is a potentially vulnerable strategy. If you do just lose your threat to a Doomblade, you're pretty far behind, and that can lead to some pretty swingy gameplay. It can even just be swingy in the sense that maybe you just draw the wrong half of your deck. You draw all your elves and you don't draw your Greater Hoof Behemoth, and you don't really have a functional deck. So thinking about this both Limited style gameplay, at least in my main cube that I'm really trying to curate, and thinking about that gameplay of tight games of lots of incremental value and small interactions between cards, that really heavy ramp strategy is not really appropriate, I think. I think I've also deliberately really toned it down in my regular cube specifically because it is such a big part of Green's identity, and if there were a few ramp spells, people kind of got confused. They were like, well, these ramp spells are kind of bad. There aren't necessarily these snowballing threats that can really recoup that value, so Green just looks kind of bad. So I've sort of deliberately really toned it down. There is one or two here or there, which I think can have a home sometimes, but it's really not trying to signal to anybody that you should be doing ramp and trying to signal to people that Green should be about doing something else.
So in your ideal world, would you have a handful more ramp cards and you just feel like you can't because it sends the signal to drafters that you can draft a ramp deck with a capital R, capital D?
I don't know if it's ideal. I mean, the thing that I do like is some of these cards that let you untap lands, especially things like Hope Tender and Voyaging Satyr that just have a lot of other interactions with being able to untap lands. You play your Squirrel Nest and you can make a bunch of squirrels. Everybody loves that.
It always comes back to squirrels with you.
Absolutely. And the cards that were just purely ramp creatures just didn't really make sense. So I think that the cube is in a better place now, having really cut down on those.
So I guess one of my questions then is, as someone who loves Green a whole lot and doesn't feel like this aspect of Green's identity fits in this cube, what is it you love about Green?
We just talked about it. Squirrels.
Okay, sure. Is it token generation? Is it small tokens? Is that what you love about Green?
Yeah, I mean, I think that has been another sort of related difficulty is that is such a big part of Green's identity. And if we're removing that, what is Green all about? And the thing that I think it is about big creatures. We have things like Sylvan Advocate and Call the Herd, which are still just about creatures and about land still, but in a different way than just about the tempo advantage.
So you like Green because it's got big creatures.
It's got big creatures and
it's
small
got
creatures.
4 mana 4/4s, and you're really into 4 mana 4/4s.
Exactly, yeah, and 3 mana 3/3s. Which I did, I think, earlier in the design of this cube feel like that was a little bit dissonant and sort of like taking something away from Green. But then, like we've said, looking at the limited environments that we've played for the last many years, it just really isn't a feature there either. So I feel like there is a lot of space for Green to do other stuff that isn't just ramp.
Have you intentionally woven some more mana fixing through Green so that Green can be like a base of a 3 or 4 color deck in your cube? Is that something you've done intentionally?
Yeah, that's something that I've been interested in, but I don't know how much it's panned out just because Green has been pretty much an aggressive color in this environment. But especially with some of the new cards they printed recently, like Bushwhack, there's Emergent Sequence, which again is one of the few ramp spells, but it does interact with a lot of other effects like landfall and +1/+1 counters. So yeah, I think I am interested in that, but it definitely isn't the main feature of Green here. If anything, maybe it's a feature of this green-blue deck that we did a whole episode last week where we went pretty in-depth in this cube in particular and talking about that strategy a bit.
So I hear that the sort of AB nature, the potential swinginess of having ramp cards which alone don't do anything and ramp payoffs which alone maybe can't be cast or aren't being maximized because you play them too late. I hear that swinginess doesn't really make sense for you. How is that different from something like the Heroic deck, for example, which has these creatures that care about being targeted and these combat tricks, which oftentimes are either unplayable or really, really not maximized if they're not targeting something valuable?
I knew you were going to ask exactly that, and I still don't have a good answer.
You don't need to have a good answer. I was just curious if you did have some thought put towards that.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that there is a similar tension. Like, it is still an A-B sort of situation. I think the difference is the combat tricks, I think, are still pretty relevant. It's rare that you have board states with no creatures in play in this environment. It's just a very creature-heavy environment. So I think those combat tricks have a higher floor than maybe you would think about in a lot of other environments.
A higher floor than, like, a Llanowar Elves?
Great question.
I don't think so, personally.
Yeah, I mean, that's fair. A lot of the combat tricks in this environment are also pretty modal, so it'll be things that can give you protection, which is relevant if you're just trying to defend one particular blocker, or maybe they are a removal spell / a combat trick, which just gives you a little bit more flexibility. Or, adventures, which just give you multiple spell casts and mitigate a lot of that downside. So I do think that comparison to, like, the fact that there are other A-B mechanics in this environment is relevant. I think it's more just about, I think that strategy is more fun. It has like more interesting gameplay moments than the ramp strategies, which often can just feel like, yep, you cheated out your thing. I don't have a removal spell, so I'm going to lose. Or I do have a removal spell, and now you lose. Obviously, it is not that cut and dried. It's a lot more complex than that. You just got to choose the right
targets so that it's not either of those things. It's what you enjoy.
Yeah, and so I will say, future cubes, I'm definitely interested in exploring this a little bit more. I think Ramp also just has, like we've mentioned a little bit, a lot of variety to it. There is just like the straight up Llanowar Elves or straight up Rampant Growth, which is essentially not really giving you a card aside from this value of the tempo advantage. But there's a lot of ramp cards that also do other things. I'm especially thinking about some of these creatures that ramp you based on their power, which sort of implies this whole other theme of like big ramp based on combining +1/+1 counters or an equipment with a creature. So that's just one other direction you could go with ramp that I'm kind of curious to explore.
I love Lotus Cobra. It's probably my favorite ramp
Lotus
card.
Cobra, yeah, like a landfall theme.
Yeah, and it's like I rode the wave of Lotus Cobra. When I first built my cube, everyone was like, Lotus Cobra's broken. It's the best 2-mana green ramp spell. Then there was a long period where people were like, Lotus Cobra's bad. Why would you play a ramp spell that sometimes doesn't ramp you? You have to just play all these other like 2-mana mana dorks instead. And now we're back on the other side where people are like, actually, this is cool again. We like it. But I've never cut Lotus Cobra from my cube because I think it is such a cool and explosive way to play a mana ramp strategy, right? Like, I love sandbagging a fetch land so that when I play my Lotus Cobra on turn 3, I can then play a fetch land and make 3 more mana and do something else with that mana, which is pretty exciting.
Yeah, I mean, I think Lotus Cobra is a great example of, I think, something we should think about more as cube designers, which is that it's not necessarily just about, is this card good or bad? It's about, does this give your players the opportunity to feel very clever? And few cards, I think, reward sort of like that little bit of clever sequencing in the same way that Lotus Cobra does. And it is really, really rewarding when you're just like, yep, play this, crack a fetch, generate a ton of mana.
It's funny. I don't think about that as being clever because it seems abundantly obvious, right? Like, it's
okay. Well,
like I don't know how experienced you have to be at Magic to realize like, oh, I should play my land that gets another land.
But you're talking
into play.
about how fun it is. It's like,
well, it's just fun because it allows, like, I think explosive moments in Magic are inherently fun. And they're also inherently swingy because a lot of times those explosive moments are just things you can't come back from. And then that's not fun for your opponent. So times where you can have explosive moments that don't feel completely unfair or feel earned in some way, like you change your sequencing a little bit, so you didn't play your fetch land on turn 1, which you ideally would have done because you wanted to get your mana fixing, but instead you're going to, play the lands you have in hand so that you can then wait until turn 3 to cast it so you can get the ramp off of it immediately in case they have a removal spell. Like, it makes you jump through some hoops, but then the opportunity for a big payoff is really fun and rewarding. So it's not that I think it's like a complicated, clever line. It's just that it's a opportunity to commit to say, I want to do the explosive thing, and I think there's a payoff for it, as opposed to I'm going to play the like safe, more obvious sequencing.
Right. I mean, it's also clever in the terms of the way that you're deck building and the fact that you're actually caring about your lands in ways that is more just about fixing. It is about, using this, like really maximizing this one card.
Yeah, I'm going to put Exploration in my cube soon, and I'm really excited to see what that can possibly do with Lotus Cobra. It makes me want to put like 1 or 2 bounce lands in there too, because the bounce lands are so good with Exploration.
Interesting.
I don't know which ones I would put in. It would be hard to, like, obviously green something. Probably like green-red, because there's a little bit of a land thing going on in green-red. Or maybe green-white.
Green-white, I like that.
I don't know. I'll look through, because I have some 2 color pairs that have additional lands, because they just have cycling lands, or they have like creature lands. Like, I know Azorius has more 2-color lands than any other color combination in my cube, because they have both Celestial Colonnade and Irrigated Farmland. And I think there's other color combinations that don't have anything beyond the fetches and shocks. So maybe they'll get a bounce land or two.
That's interesting.
As a treat.
I would be really curious if we could put a bunch of decks into the time-traveling supercomputer with bounce lands and see how those cards actually perform in a lot of high-powered cubes. I think they perform very well in, this low-powered environment of regular cube, but I think they're actually just really strong. Like, a land that draws you a card is a lot of card. The big disadvantage, obviously, especially in your cube, which is very fast, very low curving, is you're going to take a big tempo hit, but I think in higher curving, high-powered cubes, the bounce lands could actually be potentially very strong.
It's funny, I actually think in some ways you're taking a smaller tempo hit in the Bun Magic Cube, because the really rough play pattern of dual lands is when, like, it's one of your 2 lands in your opening hand, and you only have 2 and 3 drops. And it's like, okay, now not only am I playing off curve, but also I'm maybe going to have to discard a hand size if I'm on the draw. Like, it really screws everything up. I think if you can use the mana on the land you play in the first turn of the game, and use it again on the second turn before you play the bounce land, then it's essentially just a tap land that draws a card, as opposed to having these really intense limitations in terms of how they can be cast. So I actually think in a lower curving, faster environment, used sparingly, I think it's less punishing, because you actually can use all the mana you get in those weird sort of windows where, sometimes when it's like, okay, well, I got to play this bounce land on turn 2, because otherwise I don't have mana to cast my 3-drop, but I can't use the mana on either the first 2 turns of the game because of that. Or I have a 2-drop I just can't play on turn 2 because you just don't get to play your cards at all sometimes in the early turns of the game when it's in your opening hand.
Right, that can be tough.
Yeah, no, I'm talking myself into a couple bounce lands.
Nice.
I also have, I have all the channel lands, and I have Shatter Skull Smashing at all, so I think it could be a nice high ceiling there if you play around them correctly. And with Exploration and Lotus Cobra.
And Field of the Dead, I'm just going to play this bounce land and pick it back up.
Yeah, it's going to be fun.
Nice.
I'm going to do a couple of those. So in my cube, I do have a lot of cards committed to Ramp, but Ramp has been through a couple different iterations in my cube. In the earliest versions, it was the classic Ramp deck, right? You're going to play a bunch of mana dorks, and you're going to play green 6, 7, and 8 drops, basically. You're going to try and cast Ugin the Spirit Dragon, right?
Yeah, I think maybe I should be a little bit honest and transparent about this fact that maybe some of my taste for green ramp decks comes from that experience.
Yeah, I was going to say, I didn't want to be so self-centered as to think that I ruined you on ramp, essentially, in drafted formats.
Look, you've had a big influence on my Magic experience in a lot of ways. That's fair to say. And yeah, I mean, those decks were difficult to, maybe I should say difficult to have fun with, or they were difficult for me to draft. It was like, cool, I got like all of the elves, and I got Craterhoof, I got all the big stuff, and it did just often feel like, or even worse than having somebody have the Doomblade for the Craterhoof, it was just somebody had a Pyroclasm and killed your 3 elves, and it just felt like your deck was not functional.
Yeah, I think in those style of like vintage cubes where you have the all-in green ramp deck and like the all-in mono red deck or whatever, there is this tension between certain players that want to be like presenting threats and certain players that want to be trying to react to them. And if you watch someone like LSV or whoever like draft the vintage cube, it's very clear that they want to be the one like reacting to the threats. They're like, I want to take all the cards that are going to pick apart these very linear proactive decks that I know people want to draft in this cube that I know are viable, and then I'm going to try and win in some more novel, cool way. And some players just like to play the proactive thing. And my cube is in a place now where I think all of the decks have different elements of being proactive or reactive. You can't really just be all in on one strategy. And I do think it leads to the kind of play patterns you described, right? Like if you're, like I think it's correct if you're the green ramp deck and if green ramp is viable in that environment to just like take all the mana dorks, take all the big splashy spells and just jam it and hope it works. But sometimes it doesn't, and that's kind of out of your control, which doesn't feel great.
Yeah, for sure.
And to me, it doesn't feel great when you win either. It's like, okay, great, well, I did the thing.
Yeah.
You didn't
now
have
smile.
a way to respond to it.
You did the thing.
So yeah, that was what ramp looked like originally in my cube, and over the years I would say trimmed down on, but I've basically completely eliminated the top end in green. I have 1 6-drop in Primeval Titan, which is really there for like the lands combo stuff with Lotus Cobra and Titania and Field of the Dead. I have a 5-drop in Titania, and nothing else I think above 4 mana, I want to say. A couple X spells maybe.
You've got Craterhoof Behemoth.
Oh, I do have Craterhoof Behemoth there, so that's right. So actually, I do still have Craterhoof, which is there because I think it's actually one of these cards that can make a whole deck with just one card. I do have enough ramp support that I think you totally can draft a Craterhoof Behemoth deck. We saw one 3-0 a couple weeks ago, actually. But it doesn't have to be that all-in deck, or it doesn't have to be the same deck you draft every single time, right? Like, I found with just Craterhoof Behemoth, that's enough to get people to, like, sometimes draft the really committed ramp deck if they want to, but it's not really what my cube supports overall.
And maybe we should point out that you also have a lot of scalable cards that You can
I
still
do
put
have a lot of
those
scalable cards.
in the deck that has Crater Hoof and still cast them for 8 or 9 mana, and it's still relevant, and those are other powerful things you can do so that you're not relying on drawing exactly Crater Hoof.
Yes. And there's also Green Sun Zenith, which is essentially Crater Hoof number 2 that costs 1 more, which is fine in that deck if you have your Guy's Cradle and stuff. But I would say more what Ramp is doing now, or what it's doing most of the time in my cube, is letting you play a 3-drop on turn 2 and just, start spitting out 3 and 4 drops in a big mid-range deck. And decks that play 3 drops are mid-range decks for the most part in my cube. There's a lot of decks that have maybe 2 or 3 cards at 3 mana and above, and everything else is 1 and 2s. And so if your deck has a lot of 3s and a couple 4s, you are a big deck in the Bun Magic cube. And playing the mana dorks just to get to those spells a turn sooner really matters in an environment where there's really tight decision space. And so I found that Ramp feels totally different, and it feels much less committal to me in that sense, where it's like, okay, I'm playing this to play it a turn early. If you remove it, that's a speed bump, but I'm just going to play it a turn later now, as opposed to being like, oh, you removed 2 of my elves. Now I literally don't have 8 mana. I can never cast my Crater of Behemoth. It's more like, I just got to play this a little slower, and you have a window now where you can maybe set up a little bit or find more answers or find more removal. It's more of a back and forth I've found in that kind of...
Yeah, it feels much more to the other end of the extreme on that sort of tempo to combo axis, where these feel much more like tempo plays and tempo decks, and it also feels just a lot more interactive because, like you're saying, you can still do the thing. You've just lost that tempo advantage instead of your combos completely offline.
Yeah. And yeah, I still have Crater Hoof because it's exactly one of my 360 cards, and it enables a whole deck sometimes. People will just see it and take it, pack one, pick one, and that will completely change the whole direction of their draft where they otherwise wouldn't have taken it. And it does ride sideboards a lot. There's a lot of times where, I think some people that maybe only played vintage-style cubes where mono green is one of the best decks would be like, why would you ever have Crater Behemoth in your sideboard? And it's like, well, because a lot of decks in this cube just don't want to be ramping that big. They don't want to be so committal. They want to be doing this more mid-rangey tempo strategy.
Yeah, it does also do this other cool thing. We sort of talked about how the elves are kind of not a card beyond that tempo advantage, but Crater Hoof does actually change them into different resources, so you actually care about prioritizing an elf over some enchantment-based or a rampant growth type effect.
Yeah. So, I really like ramp spells in my cube, partially because they contribute to my goals of fast, explosive games. If you are going down a card, essentially, to play a mana dork in your deck for this payoff, whether it's a relatively incremental 3 or 4 mana payoff or a more explosive payoff, that tends to tip the game one way or the other, right? It's going to result in you having a decent sized advantage or your opponent have a decent sized advantage. It doesn't often lead to board stalls, I found. So I enjoyed that aspect of ramp. And I also do enjoy that it is, to me, a core part of what green does and a core part of Magic, and I do want that to be present in my cube, even if the things that you're ramping into maybe don't feel like what people expect in a vintage cube. You're not playing Ugin the Spirit Dragon, you're not playing Karn, you are just playing fair 3, 4, 5 drops.
Just playing Asika's Chariot on turn 3.
That's really good.
It is. So you mentioned in my cubes, I'm not really that interested in ramp, but should we talk about the Turbo Cube at all?
I thought about whether we should talk about it or not. To me, ramp as we're describing it is not a factor there.
Mm-hmm. It's more just you have this extra resource, which is you want mana positive spells, and it's a resource that is kind of just like playing your lands in a normal game of Magic, just compressed into one turn.
Well, actually, it's kind of interesting, maybe. What are the mana positive spells in the Turbo Cube that not every deck will want? And I think there's very few of them.
Interesting. Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, it's basically like Soul Ring, because so many of the cards cost, basically have 100% devotion. There's no generic cost associated with them, so Soul Ring kind of just doesn't do anything to help cast those unless you have specific X spells that you can dump a lot of mana into.
I've definitely played Soul Ring effectively just as a 0 mana artifact in the Turbo Cube before.
Where it's like,
I just want to be able to cast an artifact spell that doesn't cost me mana. Yeah, I mean, the Turbo Cube is weird. For those that don't know it, it's got a rules modification where everything costs 2 mana less to play. The whole cube is designed around that conceit, and you can take lots and lots of game actions in every single turn of the game. You do kind of have an attempt at what I would describe as a ramp deck with the Jade Mage green deck, because Jade Mage becomes 1 green mana for a 1/1 Sapperling, and you have ways to produce a fair amount of green mana. I don't know. I'm always interested in what that cube could look like if you committed to more ramp spells that most decks did not want for whatever reason.
Yeah.
Right now, so many of them also cantrip, or they also fix your mana, or they also up your storm count or whatever, that it just feels right to play almost all of the mana positive spells in any deck, and they're just kind of like the power of the environment you just take very highly. And I wonder if it's possible to try and lean more into ramp as a strategy. I think in some ways that cube is already very A-B in the way that all the decks work. Every single deck has like very few cards that actually matter and kill you, and a lot of cards that enable those cards to be broken. And so every deck is already a combo deck in that sense, and I think maybe introducing an additional layer of like further combo on top of that might be a bridge too far, but yeah, I don't think that the Turbo Cube really bears on this conversation.
All right, I thought I would mention it because it's kind of just like turn 0, everybody ramps in a big way, but
ramp,
it's
I mean,
weird.
well, I guess it's an important lesson in the fact that ramp is relative. If your opponent also has the same mana advantage, then you have no mana advantage, right? It doesn't matter that you're both playing 2 mana faster. You're both playing on the same tier, so like everybody had the same amount of ramp in their deck essentially, and it's the ramp that is imbued by the rules modification.
Yeah, it's funny because saying everybody's on the same tier and playing with the same advantage is not how this environment feels.
Well, if you don't know what you're doing and you draft all the bad cards, then...
And somebody won the die roll.
I'm excited to see what green ends up looking like in other cubes you're working on. You've alluded to this third, fourth cube.
For so long, I've kind of just been sort of puttering. You know, we got a lot of Magic going on. We have a lot of cubes in our play group, so it's like...
I mean, I feel like I've had a lot of cubes that have been in that space for a long time, and then we've talked about it before, that like moment, something will just click, right?
Yeah.
You'll have this list of cards that are like floating in this amorphous cloud that isn't really defined, and then you'll either... some new card will be printed that like it inspires you, or you'll like see some other deck in some other cube that functions in a way that's novel that you're compelled by, that you want to like make work in this cube. Or in my case, you'll realize you want to run 20 copies of Ash Barons, right? Like something will happen and it'll materialize, and then that whole cube will kind of just come together overnight. And I'm curious to see what green looks like in there if you're actually going to be supporting some ramp. I'm curious to see what Anthony's take on a ramp deck in a cube looks like.
We'll find out. I don't know if it's going to be good.
Well, good is all relative. Just make the rest of the decks in the cube equally we'll find outy.
All right, let's do a pack 1, pick 1, which I have randomly picked from Sasquatch's Graveyard Cube. This seems like a really interesting environment. It's a cube with a lot of like iconic cards that we're used to seeing. It's sort of built around Recurring Nightmare as one of the sort of benchmark cards, and I love graveyard themes, so I think this is going to be a fun one.
I got a pack pulled for us here. I think there'll be some things to discuss. We're just doing regular 1x15 here, right? It's a 15 card packs, 1 pick.
That is what the overview leads me to believe.
Great. So our pack is Arid Mesa, Wooded Foothills, Ethersworn Canonist, Undead Butler, Brainstorm, Hive of the Eye Tyrant, Winding Way, Jack-O-Lantern, Sakura Tribe Elder, Containment Construct, Alesha Who Smiles at Death, Tameshi Reality Architect, Cemetery Gatekeeper, Third Path Iconoclast, and Bone Crusher Giant. I think we're probably both taking a fetch land here, Anthony. Is that the case?
I think that's probably where I would end up. I don't know if that's... Honestly, I feel like maybe I've been taking fetch lands too highly. We maybe talked about this a little bit with a draft of our friend James's Forgiveness Cube we did on stream, where I almost felt like I kind of just got stuck with taking lands way too highly and kind of staying open too long. So, I don't know. Maybe I'm in a spot where I'm taking lands too highly, especially when Singleton is being broken for them, as they are in this case. But it's still really tough for me not just to take one of these fetch lands.
The idea of you taking them too highly is interesting. I think it's possible. I don't think my evaluation of a fetch land pack 1 pick 1 has changed much, and doesn't change much even if we're breaking Singleton.
Okay.
It's just, you know, again, like the Arid Mesa or the Wooded Foothills here, if you end up in a 2-color deck, you can play either of these in 7 of the 2-color pairs. Mm-hmm. So it's a really, really open pick and a really, really powerful fixing. And that's not even mentioning the ability of playing them in 3 or more color decks, how they enable splashes, how they fuel delve, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, and here specifically, I think the graveyard interactions are going to matter.
So I'm still really high on them. I'm curious, which one would you take? And then I want to talk about the rest of this pack a little more.
That's an even more difficult question. I feel like Wooded Foothills.
I think it's easy Foothills. Here's my argument.
Okay.
I think that in cubes like this, red-green often has a clearer identity than red-white. Though, as we said, taking a Wooded Foothills is not committing at all to red-green. It's committing to somewhat red or somewhat green. There's red in both of these, so you're going to get that either way. I think green is also the color that often has the most ways to abuse lands in the graveyard.
Right.
It's the color that most is able to splash into other colors and wants more fetch lands for some reason. So for me, I think it's easy Wooded Foothills. But let's look at what the rest of this pack tells us. So a couple cards stand out to me here as just defining maybe of what this cube is. You know, there's a fair bit of stuff here that is just kind of like the murderer's row of powerful Eternal Magic cards. Stuff like Brainstorm, Bone Crusher Giant, Third Path Iconoclast, those kind of cards, you know, we expect to see, I think, in cubes that are power motivated to some degree. Things like Ethersworn Canonist, which is a 1 and a white for a 2/2. Each player who has cast a non-artifact spell this turn can't cast additional non-artifact spells. That's an interesting hate bear that sometimes indicates a artifact theme, and the presence of Jack-o'-lantern would also make me think there's maybe an artifact deck here to some degree. I also am really excited to see cards like Containment Construct and Tameshi, which are 2 cards from Neon Dynasty. Containment Construct gestures towards a discard or madness related deck, but also can kind of just be played for value. If you can like cast 1 spell off of the discard of this thing, you don't have to be all in to get value off your Containment Construct. And then Tameshi is just a really cool build around that works with artifacts, works with enchantments. So I'm seeing the indication of some cool thematic tendrils in this pack, even though I'm going to take a fetch land, pack 1, pick 1, and see where this draft takes me.
Yeah, I mean, fetch land seems very safe. Bone Crusher Giant seems also very safe. If I just wanted to stay pretty open and just have a card that I know is going to perform and provide a lot of value, Bone Crusher Giant is probably where I'm at. But Tameshi is then what stands out to me next as just the thing that has a really high ceiling and leans into potentially what's happening in this environment. So that's the card that I'm really most excited about. Winding Way also stands out a little bit to me because it does put a bunch of cards in the graveyard potentially. So I'm sort of thinking about how does that perform differently here as it does in my cube.
Winding Way, historically a card that I have been very low on from a design perspective. I really don't want that kind of variance in my like card draw.
Do you not want that kind of variance, or did one time I completely turn around a game when I cast this and got 4 cards off of it?
It's happened both ways. Like I've been the one that casted and drew 4 cards and been like, haha, sucks to be you. I just did a 4 for 1. And I've also cast it and like whiffed or drawn a single card and just felt bad about it. However, I will say that in the Neoclassical Cube, Winding Way, you may not realize actually, is a riff on the iconic old card Mulch.
Sure.
Mulch does the exact same thing, but you can only get lands. This one allows you to take creatures or lands. You get to choose, so it's an improvement over Mulch. And Mulch is actually a cool build-around card, even in, like, Legacy, right? Like, I've seen 8 Mulch decks that play 4 Mulch, 4 Winding Way, and care about putting a bunch of cards in the graveyard for some reason or the other. And that's where I think this card is actually really awesome. When you actually really care about the self-mill, really care about putting cards in the graveyard, such that you remove that wild variance off of casting it. I still strongly dislike it in the regular cube, where there's very little graveyard synergy, and it's just like, I'm going to draw somewhere between 1 and 4 cards, 0 and 4, I guess, technically. Here, I think it could be a card I really enjoy playing with, if my deck is built such that I can really benefit from flipping over cards into the graveyard. And I've considered adding Mulches and Winding Ways to the Neoclassical Cube, and I might get there someday if I can make a deck work.
Could be fun.
I agree Tameshi's really sick. I don't think Tameshi is anywhere near the card you should pick out of this pack because it is committing to 2 colors. You don't want to play Tameshi in a 1-color deck, even though it is just blue to cast. But I agree that it's a really sick build around, and I could totally see just taking it and saying, I want to do Tameshi stuff, because really cool potentials there with cards like Jack-o'-lantern, with various removal-based enchantments, with self-mill, with all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, for sure.
All right, thank you, Sasquatch, for sending in your cube list. A little bit of a shorter episode, Anthony, but that's okay. We did a really long episode last week. They can't all be the same length. This is an interesting conversation about Ramp, and it's got me thinking about more things about my own cubes. I was interested to see what you do with Ramp in a cube of yours in the future.
We'll see. We'll
I want to see what those payoffs are. Like, what point of the curve are you putting them on, what are they? What are the cards you're choosing for payoffs?
You know what it honestly might be is some of those prototype cards that we talked about in green, because they also have artifact, obviously, synergies, and have that modality that makes it a little bit more flexible and easier to include. But we'll see. That's kind of where I'm thinking.
Is the idea that you would have one of the, like, say the white prototype card, and you would want both a green deck with no white to play it as a colorless ramp target, and also you would want white decks to play it without expectation of getting to the full retail mana cost?
Yeah, I think that's part of it, where it is this sort of flexibility of, like, if you're playing the ramp deck, suddenly there's a whole bunch of other cards here that just don't exist for other players, really.
I wonder if it would actually play out like that. It's a really interesting idea, and I think that's probably a big part of how they designed the prototype mechanic. Like you said, they wanted decks that were all in on Power Stones or whatever to just take these cards regardless of what color they were. I feel like in reality, they're almost always going to end up in decks of that color.
Yeah, I mean, in the same way that, like, Gitaxian Probe usually ends up in blue decks.
I don't know that I agree with that.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll put Gitaxian Probe in any deck.
You will.
Yeah. I think everyone should.
Everyone should.
The card is really good.
Yeah. But do they?
I mean, I think so, right?
I don't know.
I never get them late in the draft.
Is it time to go play more Zelda?
Yes, I think it is time to go play more Zelda. Thanks for tuning in. We're going back to play Zelda. Well, you're going to play Zelda. I'm going to watch my wife play Zelda.
Okay.
And I'm sure many of our listeners out there are also playing Zelda.
I hope this episode was a good accompaniment to playing Zelda.
May you all put the spicy fruit on your arrows and set stuff on fire.
Hey, don't spoil it for me. You're way further ahead than me.
I'm just watching Hillary set a bunch of stuff on fire. It's really, I love watching Hillary play video games. Might sound like I'm dragging her. I'm not. She did not grow up playing video games, so it's like still something that doesn't come super natural to her. And it's so fun when she totally messes up the controls. Last night...
Wow, that does sound like you're dragging her.
Last night, she was trying to tame a wild horse, and she was like sneaking up on it for a while, and she hopped on the back of it, and then she got excited when she landed on it, and immediately took out her sword, hucked it over the horse's head, and then jumped off. It was amazing.
That's what I do when I get excited.
It was the perfect comedic timing of like, it was a solid 30 seconds of like build up of like getting up to this horse, then like, yes, sword out, huck it over the horse's head, sword sticks in the ground, do a backflip off the horse runs away. It was so good.
Oh no.
Really, really
good.
I
hope she got there eventually.
Yeah, she did.
Great.
Actually, weirdly, it just kind of immediately tamed the horse. It was like a hack. She did like a speed running technique.
The horse was like, "Whoa, what was
I was like, Hillary, you traumatized that horse by hopping on back of it and just whipping your sword over its head." Anyway, that's it for this podcast. All of our music is produced by DJ James Nasty. All the Magic cards are produced by Wizards of the Coast. This show is produced by Anthony and I, thinking really hard about Magic cards and then speaking into microphones about it. Enjoy your Zelda, Anthony.
Enjoy your Zelda.
I'm glad we figured out how to get the microphones to stop picking up that weird radio station
they were
all of a sudden picking up today.
Is that what the intro is going to be? It's just weird sound?
I do have some recorded, but no, I already have the intro. I cut it out of the latest BST.